We started using TINYpulse when we were in the early stages of rapid growth, very rapid growth. And we'd added so many employees so quickly that we ended up in a place where our historical communication processes no longer worked. We'd suddenly become so big that I couldn't just walk around and update people and chat with them and see how they were feeling. They didn't know me as well, many of the new employees. They came from other environments where openness was perhaps not a part of the culture and came in with their own suspicions. And we'd taken on a really big, really challenging client that created a lot of stress in the organization. And so all of those things came together to create a real lack of harmony and some real stress in the organization. We felt like we had nearly broken the culture. We came close, and we had a community meeting, the first of its kind, where we asked people how they were feeling, what was working well, what was not working well, what were their issues, what were their concerns. And the clear sense we got was, first of all, there were a lot of things that were epiphanies, things that we should have known before. And second, that these are things that we should know on a routine and ongoing basis. And if we really care about the people who work for us, if we really care about the quality of their work experience with us, if we really want them to be successful and happy, and if we want to maintain stability in the organization, which is critical in such a competitive job market and with such highly skilled employees, then we needed to literally have our fingers on the pulse of how employees were feeling and what their concerns were. And so one of the first steps we took was to reach out to TINYpulse and to implement TINYpulse. We also use Perform. We use a lot of 360-degree feedback aspects. We have used Client Pulse as well. We use TINYpulse for onboarding. We've really sort of baked it into a lot of the operational aspects of both our leadership and our HR processes. The most important thing was that the solution needed to be able to deliver an immediate way in which our employees could make their concerns known in a fashion that felt safe to them. Right, so anonymity in the comments, in the responses, in the suggestions that people offer is key. People can feel free to criticize the culture, to call things into question, to criticize me in a way that feels safe, which again, in a high-growth environment, and we are in a high-growth environment. We've grown 55% over the last 5 years, every single year. So lots of new employees all the time who don't know whether they can or should trust me. Those new folks need to be able to express their concerns, criticize the culture, criticize the company, suggest changes in a way that feels safe. So that really is the core criteria. And the second is that we learned a long time ago that if culture is important to us, and if specific aspects of culture are important to us, then we need to measure them. We need to have an objective sense for how well we're doing so that we can double down on those things that are successful and course correct on those areas where we're not doing nearly so well as we would like. Having me connected to their feedback, I think I hope, is very important to our employees. I actually have a weekly meeting. Tuesday mornings at 9 a.m., Cindy and I sit down and we go through TINYpulse. We go through all of the comments. We look at the upcoming questions. Our employees know that we're looking at their feedback. They know simply by dint of routine. They also know because when we have our community meetings and when we have our managers meetings, we talk about what we've seen in TINYpulse. We talk about trends or themes. We talk about what we're doing with suggestions and how we're acting on them, and how we're improving decision-making, improving culture. We also talk about the feedback in TINYpulse as part of our weekly leadership team meeting. And the fact that our employees know that we're doing that is important. The fact that we're doing it is important. And the fact that when we act on their feedback, we make that known, gives people confidence that the things that we say about culture are more than just things that we say, that they create concrete action, concrete benefit. I hope as well that the way that we react to criticism in particular means that people are willing not only to respond in TINYpulse in an anonymous fashion, but they also feel free and safe to come and talk with me personally when they have concerns. And historically, that seems to be the case, but that's something that we'll have to safeguard as we continue to grow. Well, if it's true that people are the most important element in any given company, and that culture and creating a healthy and vibrant culture is critical to success, then I can't imagine that you wouldn't want to invest in the most important thing, the thing that will enable your success. That's my perspective on that. There were a few things that indicated that this was working. After we started using TINYpulse, that our use of TINYpulse was improving employee experience, improving the culture at Wheelhouse DMG. The first is that there were things that we had been doing prior to use of TINYpulse that we thought were to safeguard the mental health of employees, to insulate them from news that could be stressful, from concerns that may or may not come to fruition. So there were conversations that we would have behind closed doors. There were times that we were having conversations behind closed doors, and we weren't necessarily talking about information that was super secret that we didn't want other people to know. It was just a conversation behind a closed door. And one of the things that we learned very quickly, first in that community meeting and then through TINYpulse, was that that created anxiety and paranoia. And that people would much rather know everything that's going on, even those things that might give them a sense for risk, that might tell them, all right, if this goes wrong, this could turn out badly for some portion of the people here or for all of us. They would rather know than not know. So we immediately became much more transparent, both in describing what we were talking about at leadership team meetings, but also telling people after the fact how the discussion turned out. And we kept doors open much more, and we were much more proactive in communicating, and we immediately saw changes in feedback around the form of communication that we were offering. We also, of course, were taking a very close look at happiness scores. And when we first started to use TINYpulse, our happiness scores were not great. We really did have a cultural crisis and a crisis of communication. And so we looked for a fairly rapid improvement in those happiness scores. And we did see that over the first few months. And then we've continued to monitor since then. We've experienced lots of additional benefits through TINYpulse. Certainly, we have much higher engagement with TINYpulse today than we did when we first rolled it out a few years ago. It's now very much a part of the culture. It's also a part of the infrastructure. We've integrated TINYpulse, and in particular Cheers for Peers, with a Slack channel called Wheelhouse Wins. And so there's a constant reminder that TINYpulse exists. Our participation in our weekly question, our weekly polls, continues to increase, even when we have open text questions and we ask people for suggestions or open form feedback. I'm surprised and pleased at the level of engagement and level of participation, and hope that trend will continue. The key to keeping participation high with TINYpulse is acting on the feedback, and then making clear that you're acting on the feedback. That so clearly conveys to employees that they have influence and power, and that they can inform and change the culture and change decision-making. And because culture is so central to who and what we are, culture really is the core of our strategy. The ability to contribute to our culture, to influence the culture, to change it and evolve it over time, in part through TINYpulse, is something that people really appreciate. I would recommend using TINYpulse to anyone who cares about culture, anyone who cares about their employees, anyone who wants clear, transparent, authentic, and honest feedback, and wants to be able to act on that and improve their company. Our employees did sometimes doubt the anonymity of TINYpulse. It wasn't that they said explicitly that they doubted the anonymity. It was more that there were times when significant criticism was offered, and we would follow up and assure people of anonymity. And there were times when a response to our follow-up question was slow in coming, in a way that made us think they were pausing to decide whether it was going to be safe for them to respond. The way that we overcame it, and we continue to overcome it, is at times by sharing that feedback and continuing to emphasize that the feedback is anonymous and that we're not trying to figure out who it was. We're more interested in the feedback and what we need to do to address the issue. It's hard for me to point to something that we wouldn't have been able to accomplish without TINYpulse, but there are many things that were made much better with TINYpulse. So, for example, we focus a lot on diversity and inclusion. And TINYpulse was a platform where, particularly in the early stages, people were able to express their passions and their desire and their worry about diversity and inclusion. They were able to say, I'm concerned about this particular community, or I may be a member of this community and it seems like we have underrepresentation, or I'm worried that we're not doing anything that is deliberate enough to improve representation or to improve how welcome certain people feel in our company. And doing that anonymously through TINYpulse gave us insight into sentiments that we wouldn't have been able to get in any other way. Having Cheers for Peers integrated with a Slack channel at Wheelhouse, this Wheelhouse Wins channel has dramatically increased participation and offered not just a daily reminder, but probably 20 times a day, a reminder that TINYpulse is a part of our infrastructure, that it's a tool that we use, that it's valued, and that expressing appreciation for one another is a part of our cultural DNA that should be exercised regularly.